Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of the Leaders in Value Chain podcast. And my name is Radu Palamariu, Managing Director of Elcott Global. And this episode is going to be actually a reshare of a conversation I recently have being interviewed on SupplyChainBrain by Robert Bowman on the topic of what makes a great Chief Supply Chain Officer. Question that I know many of you are wondering, and I do believe that the following sharing session will be helpful to many of you. Please enjoy.
It's been roughly 15 years since the emergence of a corporate executive called the Chief Supply Chain Officer. The term is more than a trendy rebranding dictated by some pricey management consultant. It reflects the growing awareness by companies of the importance of the supply chain in meeting the organization's goals of efficiency, quality, customer service, and ultimately profitability. So today, we're going to learn about who this CSCO really is. The background, education, skills, and training of a modern-day star of the C-suite. My guest is Radu Palamariu, Managing Director of Europe and Asia Pacific for Elcott Global, an executive search firm specializing in supply chain titles. He'll help us trace the lineage and evolution of the CSCO, the disciplines that individual needs to master, and, most importantly, what it takes to be a great one. We'll also find out whether supply chain expertise is becoming a path to the position of CEO. Here's our conversation with Radu Palamariu. Radu Palamariu, welcome to the show.
My pleasure. Great to be with you.
Looking to talk to you now about preparing for a career in supply chain with a particular emphasis on the role of the Chief Supply Chain Officer, the CSCO, which as far as I know has been around for, maybe 15 years officially. I'm not sure exactly, but I'm wondering how the career path to that position or an equivalent of that position has changed over the years in terms of where people used to start to get to that point, where they used to come from and how they ended up there. How have you seen that change happening?
Great question. And I guess first and foremost, the angle to acknowledge is that 15 years ago, there were a lot less chief supply chain officers than there are today. Mm-hmm. The other great progress that we've made as a function over the years is that there's a lot more of them at actual board level. Now, still not enough in my view, and of course you probably would agree, and we are biased because we love the profession and the function, but there's been a significant uptick from 15 years ago to where it is now. In terms of the progress, I don't know necessarily that it's been a huge shift, but I can perhaps note a couple of the commonalities that I have seen, and our day job is executive search and headhunting for large companies, so we basically place these positions. So what I see as a general trait for this types of roles is that they tend to be filled with people that have an end-to-end background. Now, again, there's companies, and not all of them even today have this role as it is. Some do have it, and they do call it Chief Supply Chain Officer, but it's only one or two or three of the elements. But when I say end-to-end, I mean end-to-end simplistically. Let's agree on the definition, from a planning side to the procurement side to the manufacturing side, and then finally to the logistics side. So if you want the SCORE model, the plan, procure, make, deliver. So that's an end-to-end role. So typically, to be a good Chief Supply Chain Officer, and the people that make it to this role would have those end-to-end exposures, right? So it can't be that you become a Chief Supply Chain Officer and all your career has been in planning, for example, yeah? Right. Because you wouldn't be exposed to the other three elements. So end-to-end is a must, I would almost argue. There's all sorts of rotation that companies do, and there's ways in which this can be achieved. So I think that we've also made some quite good progress, right, in terms of developing the talent to have that end-to-end generally in organizations. Second, international career, international exposure. What do I mean by that? I would say, again, simplifying it, having worked in at least 2 continents, if not more. It's not enough, and you can't be in a global role. Now I'm talking global companies. Yeah, I'm not talking one country type of a company, but I'm talking big multinational companies. To be the Chief Supply Chain Officer, you got to work in at least 2 continents, in my mind. Ideally, Asia should be one of them because the growth is there. There's so much networks of production, manufacturing, and so on in Asia that typically Asia is extremely important. And then, of course, most of these multinational companies, I don't dare say all, but a larger proportion tend to be headquartered in Europe and in US or in North America. And then there's almost an assumption that, of course, you would have worked there. But then I would say another stint somewhere in either Asia, or if you're in US, do it in Europe or somewhere else helps. And then thirdly, I guess what is important, and I wouldn't put it as prevalent yet, but I would say the difference between a good chief supply chain officer and an amazing one is the ability to talk and think business first, supply chain second. What do I mean by that? Ultimately, a chief supply chain officer is a partner to the business, is an enabler of the business. And where good versus great comes in, you can be a good chief supply chain officer. However, unless you're able to consistently articulate how does this help the business, how does it make it more efficient, cost-effective to the business, how do you help the business increase market share, increase profitability, increase delight to customers, you're not really an amazing chief supply chain officer. And I would say in this day and age, for the boards and for the CEO, when they think of appointing the CSCO, that is definitely one of the things top of mind as well.
So just because you're called a chief supply chain officer doesn't necessarily mean that you're at that peak performance and peak abilities that you describe as being a great one.
Exactly. And also, in all fairness, even 15 years on, and it's still evolving, and I think COVID has helped a lot in terms of elevating supply chain, making it a topic of discussion with our parents, grandparents, and so on. So massive help there. But depending on who you ask, you're going to get a lot of different definitions of supply chain. And you're going to get a lot of different definitions even of what is a chief supply chain officer, what are their responsibilities and role, depending on the company and depending on who you ask. So that's why I'm saying that we are still in a way evolving, right? And there's companies that call it head of supply chain or chief supply chain officer. And when you look at the roles and responsibilities, it's perhaps only planning, procurement, and logistics. There's no manufacturing, right? Manufacturing is separate. It's whatever, technical operations.
Well, of course, if you are called a chief supply chain officer, there is the C, the chief in there, indicates or at least implies that you are in the C-suite. But again, it doesn't mean that you're there fulfilling the full possible function of the CSCO, even though you've got that C in your title, right?
Correct.
You only in name only. Interesting, yeah. So who is this individual these days in terms of training, in terms of skills, in terms of education and experience? Now, on the experience side, you said it should be a good idea if they've served in multiple continents. That definitely qualifies as experience. But what other kinds of skills do you need to bring to the table now in order to be a truly great CSCO?
And I'll augment further the sharing of the three principles just now, which I would call them fundamental. On top of that, about 18 months ago, we put out a book with Knut Alicke from McKinsey, where we literally asked this particular question to 26 either CEOs that came from an operations and supply chain background or chief supply chain officers. So we've literally wrote a book on your question. Conclusion to that book, again, remembering what I just said, there's elements of you've got to have a good background in end-to-end and understand end-to-end, right? You can't be a great supply chain leader if you've never run a factory, if you have no clue about procurement, if you have no clue about planning. That just doesn't work, right? That is the basic stuff. You can't be a CFO if you have no clue about accounting, right? You got to understand the fundamentals of the function. 2, you got to have international experience. 3, you have to have the business acumen. But what makes great, if you want even that further 5%, right, or 10% or 20% that really makes like exceptional chief supply chain officers. In the book, we talk about the chain model. And the chain model, each letter stands for something. C stands for collaboration, H stands for holistic, A for adaptable, I for influential, and N for narrative. So of all these discussions that we had and interviews that we had with the 26 leaders in the book, that came out very strongly. And if you think about it, it's all soft skills. It's 5 soft skills, really, that again and again came up in our conversations when we asked the CEOs or the very successful CEOs, CSCOs. They said, this is what makes a great supply chain leader. Basically, again, not to go through the whole model, and I definitely invite perhaps the listeners, if they have time or interest, to check out the book, but it's all soft skills. And I want just to double click on the idea that soft skills are actually the hard skills. Because a lot of people, and not only in supply chain, but I'll stick to supply chain, a lot of people in supply chain think, no, if I'm very good at my job, I'm going to get promoted and I'll make it one day to the suite. It could not be further away from the truth. Because it's not that hygiene factor. Yeah, sure. If you don't take a shower every day, you will stink. Yeah, sure. Right? So do it. But that's not what makes you a great leader. What makes you a great leader is that ability to be collaborative, right? The C. Holistic, think end-to-end, think the whole organization, think beyond just your function, think how are you enabling? Adaptable. How can you constantly evolve and adapt in a world that one day to the next there's different things happening, different geopolitics coming into play? You have Suez Canal blocked. You have now just the other day, right? We had a ship collide in a bridge in the States. All these things are happening at the same time, and then you got to adapt very fast. I is influential. How can you influence your board, your stakeholders, your CEO to support you and your projects and to see the importance that supply chain has? And N is the narrative. How do you tell the supply chain story in a way that people are engaged, are inspired, right? That your teams are excited to work for you and with you. These are all skills that have to do with the soft, and it's probably not a good term that we're using soft skills because it's not really soft at all. It's essential skills. So that's what I would argue makes an incredible supply chain leader.
But you're talking there about the CSCO being a champion of the supply chain discipline, in that case, within the organization, communicating with the others in the C-suite, communicating with people below and above and the board and investors. But then there's also, because the supply chain is by its very definition a series of relationships, both within and external to the organization, you also have to be very good in talking to your supply chain partners, do you not? And your suppliers. That's a skill all unto itself, I would think.
And supply chain is ultimately a mesh of networks. It's a huge ecosystem. Your company is there, right? Whoever the chief supply chain officer is representing, and then you have suppliers. Then you have suppliers of suppliers, and suppliers of suppliers, and suppliers. And then you have your clients. And then you have distributors and all the people in there. And you have innovation partners and so on. So it is absolutely critical that, yes, that this chain model and these skills are great and must have internally and equally externally. Because that's how you build, and a lot of, give you an example of a chief supply chain officer that I was talking with recently, and he was telling me that they alone in their company they had a couple of $1 billion for R&D. It's an incredibly successful technology and electronics company. At the same time, because of the work that he did in building networks and collaboration with his suppliers, they tapped into each other's R&D budget. So instead of having just his own budget, right, because he activated his suppliers and they work really well, and because of the partnerships and the collaboration, basically they all of a sudden had a 20 billion, right, 10x budget, because they were pooling resources and working closely together. That's a skill in itself. And that's where supply chain becomes a competitive advantage for a company, as opposed to simply a tactical delivery type of a function.
Well, let me inject another factor into this discussion. Indeed, you just did. You used the word technology. You've described to me all of these very human qualities, the so-called soft skills that a successful CSCO has. And yet we are in an age of unparalleled technological advances to help the supply chain, especially with things like artificial intelligence and stuff like that. So to what degree should, in addition to all those other skills you just mentioned to me, to what degree should this individual also have some knowledge of analytics and technology? Are those skills that they need to possess as well, or can they rely on somebody else to provide that side of the skill set?
Great question, and we actually got this a lot when we came up with the chain model, and a lot of people asked, hey, shouldn't there be a T in there for technology? Back to hygiene factors. Technology is one of them as well for me, because you can't run any function in any business, I would dare say, in this day and age, even if you're selling luxury analog watches, right? Even if you're Rolex. I'm not talking Apple watches, right? Even that, of course, if to be on top of your game, you have to master technology. That's just a given. Nobody's operating on pen and paper. So to your point, you got to have a good understanding of technology. However, where I draw a line, you don't need to be and you should not be the expert. It's impossible. I mean, technology is moving at a pace that I dare say none of us can keep up with. None of us. Even if you're a professor at MIT, and I know a few, completely overwhelmed with so much development at the same time that no one person, even if they're just day in, day out studying these things, they cannot keep up with it.
Mm-hmm.
So the key is to understand and, of course, embrace technology, because otherwise you're really dead as a chief supply chain officer. Understand the potential. Keep yourself, again, with the exposure to external, whether it's innovation centers, innovation events, whether it's schools, whether it's startups, whether it's different ecosystems externally as well as internally, right? Make sure that you have teams working on different projects. But then when it comes to, let's take your example of analytics, you don't need to be the expert. You shouldn't be the expert in analytics, but you should damn well have somebody in your team that is the expert in analytics and that knows how to best leverage technology to get the best out of the data, out of the systems, the processes, the networks that you have running in your company to constantly optimize and modernize it. So without tech, you're dead. At the same time, if you are too geeky, if you get lost in the weeds of it, that's not your job as a chief supply chain officer. Your job is to set the North Star and then get the right people working on these projects for you.
So we've talked about skills, we've talked about experience. I want to talk about education. Now, back in the day before there was any such thing as a CSCO, there was a handful of very good schools with very good supply chain programs. Started out as logistics programs, became supply chain programs. There's many, many more now. How good a job do you think, Radu, universities are doing today to prepare their students for this career according to your definition of what makes a great chief supply chain officer?
Look, I don't want to get myself in trouble with a lot of professors and followers, but let me first start by acknowledging the huge progress that has been made in terms of just having curriculum in supply chain in the first place, right? I mean, 10, 15 years ago, there was almost nothing. Maybe you found some things in logistics. There was some things in logistics. Manufacturing, lean stuff, there's been courses on that for a while, yeah. But supply chain, not really. This is fairly new, yeah. 10, 15 years ago, we started having. And then also with COVID, there's been maybe not an explosion, but definitely a multiplication of this, which is great, right? Because it is important that we start having this more and more. And there's literally quite a lot of people that have started taking supply chain versus even finance and things like that. There's been several articles written about that. So that's amazing. Now, in general, and not only in supply chain, in general, I see education at large, universities at large in the world, super struggling with. Because again, we live in an acceleration of technology, of new things coming up. It's very difficult. Nobody can keep up with it. I would dare say that in general, there's countries that do it better, yeah. But in general, most educational systems for most stuff are outdated, badly outdated. Professors are not keeping up or blatantly outdated with stuff, right? Things are progressing at such a fast pace that it's impossible to do it. And we need a bit of a revolution in education overall. Now, double-clicking on supply chain, I think that there's some great programs out there, yeah? I think MIT, they have an MIT X that has a very specific supply chain, different subsectors or slices in supply chain, including AI in supply chain. They do an amazing job. It's available online as well. And there's a couple of other schools that do an amazing job, yeah? So I think there is definitely quite a few programs that are well run and thought through and some amazing professors out there. But by and large, I think a lot more work should be done, can be done, will be done. And look, the benefit and the beauty of it all is that in this day and age, I would argue that you don't actually need, I mean, it's again, if you go to an MIT X, it's a great program, don't get me wrong. But you don't really need to go to an MIT X. I mean, there's so much free resources readily available. I think first and foremost, if you have the willingness to learn and you have the drive and passion, there's a wealth of information already existing out there. And a lot of it is free, yeah? And you have all these online programs as well, where Udemy and you name it, where there's so much. I mean, okay, it's $10 or $20 or $30, right? There's so much things that you can learn. That's not necessarily where I see the crux of it. I see the crux of it is do you have that burning fire in your belly to make it work? And then, of course, knowledge is great and is important, but then back to soft skills, right? I mean, to apply it to get your organization, your manager, your wherever you sit in the organization at that point in time, or if you're a student, right, just learning, and then you're going to step into the corporate world. That part, again, you're not going to learn it in a course. Unlikely that you're going to learn that in a course, right? So that's the part where you just need to have life experience, case study experience, internships, whatever it is.
Finally, Radu, I want to be able to assess the degree of awareness of the importance of the CSCO and similar types of positions. Throughout the many years of business, CEOs have rarely come from supply chain or logistics. They've come from sales, marketing, maybe finance more often. Today, the CSCO of today, to what extent is that position able to serve as a springboard to the position of CEO?
That's another point that we made in the book. We actually chose a few CEOs in the book that came from Chief Supply Chain Officer or Chief Operations Officer. So it certainly is possible, and we've had quite a few examples. Now, overall, we actually looked at the statistics, and overall, in the top S&P 500, and if you look at the top 200 companies listed on the European Stock Exchange, the percentage is somewhere around 10 to 15% come, not necessarily from Chief Supply Chain Officer, but from some sort of supply chain related roles. So it's 10 to 15% at the moment. Can we go even higher? Yes, I think certainly we can. Ultimately, let's just agree or set the context that supply chain, in my mind at least, is the nervous system of the organization. Why do I say that? Because if it stops, the whole org stops. You have no product to sell, you're dead. Your product is stuck in the wrong place, you're dead. Or you lose, okay, maybe you're not dead, it's a bit of a tragedy, but you lose clients, right? You lose business. So ultimately, supply chain is the function that touches all the different aspects of the organization. So it's only logical, if we work on that context, that chief supply chain officers should be, and we should see even more of them going to CEO. Now, what I think will increase maybe from 10 to 15% that we are at now to 20, 30% hopefully in the near future, what will increase this percentage of chief supply chain officers, chief operations officers going to CEO are a couple of the things that we've talked about before, but most importantly, that business focus, the fact that they also need to make sure. So for COOs in some organizations, they run sales. Sales come under the COO. For chief supply chain officers, typically sales and marketing are not in it. So then they really need to make sure they are exposed to that side of the business, to going and meeting clients, right? To having that commercial acumen, which is quite critical if you are a CEO. And two, so is that customer and business orientation. Always talk business, always think business. Back to the example just now, right? How can I utilize my network of suppliers to all of a sudden 10x my R&D budget, to all of a sudden be able to come up with products that put me in the prime position as opposed to my competition. That is a competitive advantage. That basically brings business value, that makes the company better. Then you're CEO material, right? Because what's the ultimate job of the CEO? It's that, right? It's leading the company to be the best in its field. So those are the things that I think will make chief supply chain officers better and increase that percentage. Focus on the business, focus on the value you bring to the business, focus on being there in the client discussions as well, in the customer discussions as well, because that's ultimately what makes a successful business, right? Having more clients. And of course, all the good stuff that we talked about, that's again fundamentals, right? Knowing how to run an end-to-end, having international exposure, all of that good stuff that we've spoken about, that is fundamentally sound. You got to have it.
Well, we can only think that the disruptions of recent years have made all the more painfully evident the truth of what you say about the importance of the CSCO and supply chain in an organization. So, Radu Palamariu, I want to thank you so much for taking time to speak to me about the current status of the CSCO, where they came from, where they are, where they're going, and just how important they are in organizations today. Thank you very much for being with me today.
My great pleasure, Robert.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. If you liked what you heard, be sure to go to www.elcotglobal.com and click the podcast button for all the show notes of the interview. Also, subscribe to our mailing list to get our latest updates first. If you're listening through a streaming platform like iTunes, Spotify, or Stitcher, we would appreciate a kind review. 5-star works best to keep us going and our production team happy. And of course, share it with your friends. I'm most active on LinkedIn, so do feel free to follow me. And if you have any suggestions on what to do and who to invite next, don't hesitate to drop me a note. And if you're looking to hire top executives or transform your business, of course, contact us as well to find out how we can help.